All right, my friends, we are going to get started. Waiting for people to arrive. I think we've got who we've got for the evening. So I don't want to minimize, I want to maximize. Okay. Bear with me here. I'm trying to get us to the right screen. Okay. So we should be looking at Canvas right now. And this is in the module section. So I just wanted to kind of show you guys where you can find this information so you can study from it. So you click on modules on the left-hand side, this lovely list here, click on modules. And in the introduction is where you find the CID for the course, you find the schedule for the course, and the course syllabus. So we refer to the schedule very often. So I'm just going to pull it up really quick. I believe today you have a quiz that is due, and you also have homework that is due. So your quiz is only over the brain up through the meninges, and homework is actually only 4.2. There is not a 4.3. So hopefully that alleviates any stress you guys were feeling about the homework. And someone's trying to chat with me and I can't get it. Oh. I have not done attendance yet. I'm trying to stall so I can make sure people are here. We'll do attendance in just a moment. Okay, so please make sure, because it's due tonight, that you do your quiz and you do your homework 4.2. So I want to make sure everybody gets credit for that. Okay. Next, I wanted to show you, so let's go back to modules. I wanted to show you the lectures that we're doing tonight. Under exam 2, which is where we're at now, we have a few slides left of the brain that we're going to cover. And then we're going to do the cranial nerves. And if we have time, we might do a crash course video. And if not, you have that link there available for you, Crash Course Central Nervous System, to watch. I try to post links, especially links that I use in class that are helpful for you as you're studying and learning. Okay, so now we are going to do attendance. So if you have volume, please unmute yourself when I call your name. There's a few people I already know who are here. But if you can, please just let me know that you're here. Shahir? Wait, am I in the right page? Nope, I'm not. Hold on. Everything's the same. Don't worry. It's just the people who are different. Let's say that's a bigger list. We're in a smaller class. There we go. Alexandra, are you here?
Yeah, I'm here.
Okay. Elizabeth Aylward? Melissa?
I'm here.
Okay. Whoops, whoops, whoops. Okay. Clara?
I'm here.
Your table is ready.
Jeremy. Jeremy Conley.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm here.
Thank you. Hudson.
Here.
Thank you. Taylor, I know, is here. Elizabeth Olney. Elizabeth. She's not here right now. Adam, are you here?
Yep, I'm here.
Okay, great. All righty, so what we're going to do is we are going to finish up with our brain chapter, which is just a few slides, and then we'll get into the cranial nerves. So we're starting on the brain on slide 53. Okay, I have to hide this so I can see what I'm looking at here. All right, so actually to help, I'm going to back up one slide. So remember when we talked about the dural venous sinus, which is formed when the dura mater folds inwards. So the venous sinuses are areas where fluid collects. Okay, so in these sinuses, you have extensions from the arachnoid membrane, the arachnoid mater, and these extensions are called arachnoid villi. And they penetrate into the dura mater layer, into the superior sagittal sinus. And the purpose of these granulations is this is where cerebral spinal fluid is reabsorbed into venous circulation. So cerebral spinal fluid is flowing up and out into the sinus, which is then recirculated in the brain. So the cerebral spinal fluid is recirculated into the circulatory system itself. And that happens in this example, in the superior sagittal sinus. So you have these extensions from the arachnoid mater that extend up through the dura mater into the sinus where it can do this. Okay, so cerebral spinal fluid surrounds all exposed surfaces of the central nervous system. So functions of cerebral spinal fluid cushions delicate nerve structures. So we kind of talked about this in class the other day about purposes of cerebral spinal fluid. Cushioning is definitely a function. Supporting the brain, carries nutrients to that delicate neural tissue, helps make sure it's carrying oxygen to that delicate neural tissue as well. Even though it is highly vascularized, the cerebral spinal fluid also plays a role in delivering nutrients and taking away waste. So it supports the brain. So transport nutrients, chemical messengers like hormones or other messengers, and getting rid of waste products. Okay, blood supply to the brain. So the brain itself requires a large amount of blood. So every heartbeat, 15 to 20% of the blood that is pumped out of the heart goes to the brain. So any interruption of this blood flow to the brain can cause you to become unconscious and can lead to brain damage if it lasts any amount of time. And the reason this is because there is such a high metabolic rate of these neurons. They need energy and oxygen in high demand. And if the blood that's carrying the energy, the glucose, and carrying the oxygen that it needs is not being supplied basically immediately, those nerve cells will start to die. So getting an adequate amount of blood supply is incredibly important. Okay. The brain receives blood through arteries. So the internal carotids, the vertebral arteries, And the vertebral arteries join to form the basilar artery. And we'll see this in the next slide. And the carotids and the basilar artery join to form what's known as the cerebral arterial circle, or the circle of Willis. And this is a real thing. This is a real structure that when I read medical records, which is my other job, they refer to the circle of Willis fairly often when we're talking about stroke victims, especially if it's an embolytic stroke, where there's a blood clot that has lodged in the brain. Okay, so this is an important picture for you, and it shows you your internal carotids. So here's your internal carotids, your vertebral arteries. You have two of those, and they join to form the basilar artery. And this is unique because in general, arteries branch into smaller and smaller branches. It's veins that join together into larger veins. So this is an exception in the arterial system where two smaller arteries join together to form one larger artery. So two smaller vertebral arteries join together to form one larger basilar artery. And so the cerebral arterial circle, or the circle of Willis, is formed by your anterior communicating artery, which forms that anterior arch, the posterior communicating arteries, and your basilar artery in your internal carotids. All of these play a role in the circle of Willis, or the cerebral arterial circle. But in medical records, it's referred to as circle of Willis, which I think is probably more common of what you're going to see and hear in the medical field. Oh, I forgot that I highlighted these. So enjoy this. So the cerebral arterial circle, circle of Willis, all of these structures. So, oh, I forgot posterior cerebral artery as well. So I wish I could erase. I'm still getting used to this stylus. Oh, I figured out how to erase. Yay. Okay. So all of these arteries listed that I circled are part of the circle of Willis. They may be just a little tiny bit, but they're still part of it. And you should know the arteries that help form the circle of Willis. And so we're going to talk about what's the significance of the circle of Willis. I just spent all this time showing you the arteries that are involved in forming the circle of Willis. Why? So again, it's formed by the connection of the communicating arteries and the internal carotids and the basilar artery, and it forms a ring. And as I mentioned before, this is unique because usually arteries branch. So here is the significance. Without having this circle, each segment of the brain that is fed by a major artery would be cut off from the other segments vascularly. So what this means is, oh, sorry, sidebar, nerve tissue is very interconnected. There are so many connections. So if you remember, we were talking about the cerebellum, and the Purkinje cells had over 200,000 connections to other neurons. Nerve tissue is very interconnected, and they depend on other parts in order to work properly. So if one area doesn't work well, other areas are going to suffer. So let's say somebody had a stroke and there's a clot somewhere in the brain and it's blocking the flow of the blood. Blood pressure can force blood around that circle to make up for any lack of pressure in any part of the brain elsewhere. So it helps compensate for damage that may have occurred, an injury that may have occurred, to help continue to supply blood to the rest of the brain so that it can function and survive. So the circle of Willis, the cerebral arterial circle, has a very important function in making sure that all the parts of the brain are able to receive blood supply on a constant basis, even if there is damage or injury. Okay, we'll talk briefly about the blood-brain barrier. So endothelial cells, these are cells that line all of the capillaries that are the smallest vessels in the circulatory system. And capillaries have tight junctions between them. So tight junctions are the connections between cells where it's basically watertight. Nothing can get in between those cells. They're tight, for lack of a better word. In addition to these tight junctions that the endothelial cells have, astrocytes, which are a glial cell, have these processes that play a role in capillary permeability. So what happens is these foot processes of astrocytes wrap around a capillary and make the capillary wall essentially even thicker, more difficult for substances to pass through. So this affects the permeability characteristics of the capillaries, of the blood-brain barrier. So for example, substances that are lipid soluble are able to pass through by diffusion, simple diffusion. So examples would be nicotine, ethanol, and heroin. I wouldn't recommend them, but they pass through the blood-brain barrier easily and affect your nerve tissue. Then substances that are water soluble have to be moved in by a transport mechanism. And so examples of this would be amino acids that are used to build proteins and glucose that's used to fuel the nerve cells. These are water soluble and they need to have a mechanism to move them in through that membrane, whereas lipid soluble can just pass straight on through. Okay. This is an excellent picture of the cranial nerves. Hint on the excellent picture. There are 12 pairs of cranial nerves, and they are all listed on the left-hand side here. They are listed, or they are named both by a name, like olfactory nerve or neuron, and by a Roman numeral. I would highly recommend that you know both. I know it seems like a lot of work, and maybe you can use some flashcards or some sort of flashcard app or program to study these from, but you will definitely need to know the cranial nerves, either the name or through the Roman numeral. You will need to be able to identify the cranial nerves and their accessory structures. So looking at number 1, the olfactory bulb, the structure right here, This bulb itself is what's resting right over the cribriform plates, and those little nerve fibers pass into the nasal cavity and pick up those scents chemically, and then it's transported through the olfactory tract to the olfactory center where it's processed. Number 2 is the optic nerve. And the optic nerves pass all the way up to where the eyes are. Okay. Those optic nerves, when they enter into the brain, they cross over at a place called the optic chiasm. So nerve fibers, so let's say this is the left and this is the right side. So nerve fibers from the left cross over through the optic chiasm and go down to the right. And nerve fibers from the right cross over at the optic chiasm and travel to the left side of the brain. So the optic chiasm is where those nerve fibers cross to the opposite side of the brain. Couple structures that you can see in this picture, which is really helpful, is the pituitary gland and the mammillary body. Okay, we are going to go through these different nerves next in our cranial nerve chapter. So I'm not going to go through all of these right now. We are going to do that next. So let me pull that up for you. If it will let me. Okay. All right, are we able to see the sign that says cranial nerves? I'm gonna assume so because everyone's being so quiet. Okay, so this again is in the module section, and this is the exact same PowerPoint that I'm using tonight is what is posted on in the modules. Okay, and I'm also going to be referring to our top hat material as we go along. There is a great table at the first part of chapter 4.5 of the cranial nerves. And I'm going to be referring to that, but it's really good because it shows you the Roman numerals, and then it gives you the nerve name, tells you whether it's sensory, motor, or mixed, and it gives you a mnemonic to help remember, and then also nerve functions. So it's a really great summary to study from. So that's 4.5 in Top Hat. And the course material is always available. It's just the homework that becomes due later. Okay. So some background with cranial nerves. Cranial nerves are actually part of the peripheral nervous system. So the central nervous system is made up of the brain and spinal cord. These cranial nerves branch off of the brain and are part of the peripheral nervous system. So they're not part of the central nervous system. So it's kind of interesting. They branch off of the brain, but they're still not part of the central nervous system. There are 12 pairs of cranial nerves, and you can find these on the inferior surface of the brain. Okay, the most anterior cranial nerve is cranial nerve number 1, the olfactory nerve. And the most posterior is number 12, the hypoglossal nerve. And so they're named or they're numbered in order from anterior to posterior. So here's that same picture that we just looked at. And again, it's a great slide to study from. It is likely the one that I will use when you need to do identification. But just note that the nerves are numbered 1 through 12, running from anterior, if I can type, from anterior to posterior. This is an inferior view of the brain, so we're looking at it from underneath. Here is an actual human brain or cadaver brain showing you those same nerves. It's a little harder to see them because they're not color-coded separately, but you can see the olfactory bulb here, olfactory tract, the optic nerve, the optic chiasm where they cross over, the infundibulum for the pituitary gland. The pituitary gland is not there. These two small bumps are the mammillary bodies. And then we see some other structures. So the oculomotor nerve, number 3. Of note, you have the basilar artery. Remember, the basilar artery is where vertebral arteries on either side join together to form a larger artery, which is the basilar artery. On this side of the brain, we can see more of the smaller cranial nerves. So you see the optic chiasm, the optic tract, the mammillary body. Trochlear nerve is pretty small and thin. Trigeminal nerve has the word tri in it, so there's going to be, it's split into 3 parts, which we'll talk about. The abducens nerve, pretty small. Facial nerve is very tiny, and it's right next to the vestibular cochlear nerve. And then you have several others that are also very small. Glossopharyngeal and the vagus, hypoglossal, and accessory nerves. All of these are fairly thin little nerves. Okay, so the names of the nerves. So nerve number 1 is the olfactory cranial nerve. Number 2 is the optic. Number 3 is the oculomotor. Number 4 is the trochlear. 5 is the trigeminal. 6 is the abducens. And in just a second, we'll talk about each of these separately. 7 is the facial nerve. 8 is the vestibular cochlear. 9 is the glossopharyngeal. 10 is the vagus nerve. 11 is the spinal accessory nerve. And then 12, the last cranial nerve, is the hypoglossal nerve. Okay, so now we're going to look at each individual nerve and its function. So olfactory nerve, nerve number 1, is involved with your sense of smell. That is its main focus, its main job. The optic nerve helps with detecting vision. The ocular motor. So if we just take the word apart, oculo is referring to eye, and then motor is referring to basically movement. So ocular motor nerve helps control eye muscle for eye movement. And also helps control the focusing of the lens. So the lens changes shape in order to focus the image to the back of the eye. And also involved with the constriction of the pupil. Okay, number 4, the trochlear nerve. The trochlear nerve is also involved with the eye, controls the superior oblique muscle of the eye. The trigeminal nerve, so again, that has the tri in it, that trigeminal is split into 3 parts. Helps detect head and face sensations. Controls chewing movements. The abducens, number 7, controls the lateral rectus muscle of the eye. So far we have several different cranial nerves that are involved with the eye. The trochlear, the abducens, and the optic and the ocular motor all have functions to do with the eye. Okay. The number 7, the facial nerve, involves with detecting taste and allowing facial expressions. Just a sidebar to this, I was reading a news article today about a man who had a facial transplant and 2 hand transplants successfully. It's pretty amazing what we can do in medicine now. But you wake up with a completely different face. Okay. Vestibular cochlear, number 8. Vestibular cochlear has to do with your ear, and your ear is involved with balance and sound. So your vestibular cochlear nerve is involved with those senses. Glossopharyngeal, number 9. So glosso is referring to the tongue. So controls muscles that are used for swallowing. Your tongue is heavily involved in that process. It forms that ball of food called a bolus when you're eating, and it pushes it back to the back of your throat, where then that swallowing reflex takes over. And the glossopharyngeal is also involved in detecting sensations from the tongue. So feeling the texture of your food, for example. Okay, number 10, the vagus nerve detects thoracic and abdominal organ sensations. So this is the nerve that travels way outside of the brain and the head, goes all the way down to the gastrointestinal region. So controlling thoracic and abdominal movements. So the vagus nerve is involved in far-reaching areas far away from the brain. The spinal accessory nerve controls the trapezius and the sternocleidomastoid muscles, which are muscles you're going to learn very soon. And then last, number 12, the hypoglossal. This controls tongue movement. Okay, So we can classify cranial nerves in a couple different ways. They can be sensory nerves, which are involved in transmitting impulses from the periphery to the central nervous system. So from the outside in. We also would call these afferent nerves. We can also classify them as motor nerves, which transmit impulses from the central nervous system out to the periphery. This can also be referred to as efferent nerves. So efferent is out, afferent is in. Then you can also have mixed nerves that are able to transmit impulses both ways, both directions, both out to the periphery and then also into the central nervous system. So nerves that are afferent, that are transmitting signals from the periphery to the central nervous system. Make sure I got that right. Yes, from the periphery to the central nervous system. That is afferent. The olfactory, optic, and vestibular cochlear. So involved is your sense of smell, sight, hearing, and balance. Those are afferent. Efferent is the opposite. So traveling from the central nervous system out to the periphery. If I can spell. So oculomotor, trochlear, abducens, spinal accessory, and hypoglossal are all considered efferent nerves, transmitting their signals from the brain to the periphery. Then those that are mixed, that are both afferent and efferent, are the trigeminal, the facial, glossopharyngeal, and the vagus nerve. Okay. Cranial nerves pass through different foramina of the skull, which is why we learned those to arrive at their particular destinations. So we are going to learn some of those foramina and which cranial nerve it's associated with. So the olfactory nerve fibers pass through the olfactory foramina, through the cribriform plate. Optic nerves pass through the optic canal. The vestibular cochlear nerve passes through what's called the internal acoustic canal. So these are all sensory cranial nerves. These are afferent. So here we are looking at our olfactory nerve. So this is the olfactory bulb that sits on top of the cribriform plate. Nerves go through the olfactory foramen or foramina and innervate the nasal cavity. Okay, with the optic nerve, passes through the optic canal, which you don't see in this picture, but you do see how the nerve fibers cross to the opposite side of the brain at the optic chiasm. So this point right here is a chiasm. Okay, and then looking at the vestibular cochlear nerve, which is really two nerves that join together, the cochlear nerve and the vestibular nerve join together to form the vestibular cochlear nerve, and it exits through the internal acoustic meatus and then to the brain. Okay, afferent or motor nerves. The ocular motor nerve passes through the superior orbital fissure. So if you remember, this is that big kind of gash-like structure in the back of the orbit, in the back of the eye cavity. It's the big fissure. So the ocular motor passes through there. The trochlear nerve passes through there. The abducens also passes through there. So 3 different cranial nerves pass through the superior orbital fissure. The spinal accessory passes through the jugular foramen. So not just the jugular vein is passing through that jugular foramen, there's also the spinal accessory nerve. The hypoglossal nerve passes through the hypoglossal canal. That's an easy one to remember. It's named the same. Okay, so looking at nerves that pass through the superior orbital fissure is our trochlear nerve and our ocular motor nerve and our abducens nerve. All pass through the superior orbital fissure into that posterior region behind the eye and innervate muscles around the eye and then the eye itself. Okay, looking at the hypoglossal nerve and the accessory nerve, these are passing through the hypoglossal canal. And hypoglossal, hypo means below, glossal is referring to tongue. So it's coming up below the tongue. In addition, there's a branch that innervates some skeletal muscles, the sternocleidomastoid muscle, and a few other smaller muscles as well. And then the accessory nerve also innervates part of the sternocleidomastoid muscle and the trapezius. Okay, mixed cranial nerves. The trigeminal nerve is a mixed, which means that it sends signals both to and from the central nervous system. So there's 3 portions to the trigeminal nerve. There's the ophthalmic portion, which travels through the superior orbital fissure and is involved with the eye. A maxillary portion, which passes through the foramen rotundum. And a mandibular portion, which passes through the foramen ovale. This is all part of the same cranial nerve, but it's branched into 3 sections which pass through 3 different foramen. Then the facial nerve, it is sensory and passes through the internal acoustic canal and the stylomastoid foramen. So 2 different foramen. So the facial nerve is basically split and passes through 2 different foramen to the face in the sensory. And the motor does the same thing. So the sensory and motor divisions of the facial nerve both pass through the internal acoustic canal and the stylomastoid foramen. So here we can see the trigeminal nerve. So the trigeminal nerve, it starts with one and it has 3 branches. So branch number 1, the mandibular branch, passes through the foramen ovale. The maxillary branch here passes through the foramen rotundum. And then lastly, the ophthalmic branch passes through the superior orbital fissure. So there are a lot of nerves that are passing through the superior orbital fissure. Quite possibly one of the reasons it is so large. Okay. Then we are looking at the facial nerve. The facial nerve passes through either the stylomastoid foramen or through the internal acoustic canal, which is what's represented right here. And that innervates the face. Okay, mixed cranial nerves, the glossopharyngeal. Sensory portion passes through the jugular foramen. The motor division also passes through the jugular foramen. The vagus nerve is also a mixed cranial nerve. Sensory passes through the jugular foramen, and the motor division passes through the jugular foramen. So both of these, whether it's sensory or motor, is passing through the jugular foramen, both to and from the brain. So sensory is bringing information to the brain from the periphery, and motor is bringing signals from the brain to the periphery. So here we have a view of the glossopharyngeal nerve. And so it splits down, goes down, vagus nerve down here, down to the intestines. And then you can see even better with this picture how the vagus nerve is passing through the jugular foramen, branches off a little bit in the glossopharyngeal area, but then travels all the way down through the thoracic cavity, down into the abdominal cavity and innervates structures like the stomach and the small intestines. So it's a major player in the digestive system, but it's a cranial nerve, which is kind of interesting. Okay, we have gotten through all of our cranial nerves. How about we, I'm gonna let you watch. I'm gonna wait, let me share my screen again. Okay, so just want to show you again, when you're in Canvas, go to modules. And there's a video I would recommend that you watch. I'm not going to make you do it tonight because I know you have a quiz. So scroll down to exam 2. It's Crash Course CNS. And I think it's about 10, 11 minutes long. And it kind of gives you an overview of the central nervous system. So it might be a nice little refresher, but I'm not going to require it, but I just want you to know that it's there. So I'm going to let you go for tonight because I know you have quizzes that's due and homework that's due. Are there any questions? Okay. May I ask who came in a tiny bit late for attendance? I want to make sure I caught you. I thought it was Hudson. Maybe it wasn't. Elizabeth. There we go. Caught you, Elizabeth. You are here. Okay, then it looks like everybody else is here. Good. All right, then. Have a fantastic night. Good luck on your quiz if you haven't taken it already. Please don't forget to do your homework, and I will see you in class on Monday. Have a great weekend.
It happens to all of us. We buy a new home when we turn into our parents. What I do is help new homeowners overcome this. Was it adjustable spanner? Good choice. Don't forget your not 60 You have nowhere to sit.